This video is sponsored by Movie Palette.
As you're probably aware, Scream 6 is about to hit cinemas, and I plan on reviewing that at some point on this channel in the next week. There's one teeny tiny problem with that though. I've never seen any of the Scream movies before. I know, I'm the film brain, but you know, I can't have seen every single movie. There are still gaps in my knowledge, and the entire Scream franchise is one of them. In my defense, the first movie came out when I was 5 or 6 years old. I was not exactly the target demographic. Although that's probably not really an excuse considering that Jenna Ortega wasn't even born when the original Scream movies came out, and now she's top billing the sequels. And I do have to admit that when I was younger, I was really not a horror fan at all. I liked action movies and I liked comedies, and I would sometimes see movies that were rated a little bit older than I was, certainly, but with horror, I generally just stayed away from it, particularly if it was a straight-up 18 certificate horror film like the entire Scream franchise was. So I just never got around to seeing them, and by the time I was making videos about films, I was watching movies almost every single day, so that means I'm constantly trying to keep up with what's newest and what's latest out. It gives me very little downtime to actually go back and watch some of these movies that I've missed. So now I am taking the opportunity to actually go back and fill in this great big hole in my film knowledge. Let's do it. Let's go and watch all the Scream movies together. Before I start this journey, let's talk about where the Scream movies came from. The first 4 Scream films were directed by the late Wes Craven, an iconic horror director of the period who came up making notorious movies like The Hills Have Eyes and The Last House on the Left, who had a big mainstream hit in the 80s with A Nightmare on Elm Street. Elm Street was so successful that it launched a franchise that had yearly installments across the rest of the 80s, but it also gave Craven the freedom to explore his own projects away from the Elm Street franchise, which generally had middling results for the most part. Craven would return to the Elm Street franchise in 1994 with New Nightmare, which many people consider to be the dry run for Scream because of its metatextual narrative, which is set in the real world and focuses on the actual actors that played the characters in the Elm Street movies, particularly Heather Langenkamp. Craven himself even appears in the movie as a character. New Nightmare was well received at the time, but it wasn't successful at the box office, and that's because the horror genre had fallen out of vogue in the early 90s. Many of the genre staples that had dominated the 80s, like Friday the 13th or Elm Street itself, had come to their natural conclusion, and that left a big gaping void in the early part of the 90s. But also, because the 80s was so dominated by that slasher cycle, virtually everyone knew all the tropes of the genre backwards and forwards. Craven would mix comedy and horror, which he'd do more successfully the following year with Scream, with 1995's Vampire in Brooklyn, an otherwise work-for-hire job that unusually put him alongside Eddie Murphy, and it's an awful movie. I may not have seen Scream, but I am unfortunate enough to have seen Vampire in Brooklyn, which genuinely can't decide whether it wants to be a comedy or a horror film, and ends up being kind of neither. Craven really needed a comeback, and boy did he get one. So yeah, I just got done watching Scream, the original one from 1996, and yeah, it turns out it's pretty great, isn't it? The opening sequence of Drew Barrymore is fantastic. It pretty much works as a short film onto itself, especially because it sets you right on edge from the beginning of the movie. There's no preamble at the beginning of it. It is title card and then straight into Casey receiving that first phone call. And then Wes Craven just gradually ratchets up the intensity for the entire rest of the sequence. I think this might be the best example of Craven's talent as a filmmaker. When he was on form, this was the best of what he could come up with. I think one of the best examples of Craven's direction is the popcorn gag, where Casey has popcorn on the stove, and as it's popping and expanding, the tension is increasing, and then over the course of the rest of the sequence we see it start to to catch fire, but of course Casey's attention is being pulled away from that fire, means that you've got smoke billowing all through the house, which means that you've got a nice big cinematic haze as Casey runs back through the kitchen, which is always important. What makes that sequence feel so immediate and so terrifying is Drew Barrymore's performance, because she reacts in a way that feels grounded and realistic, and she carries the whole entire section of the movie there, because we don't see the killer until towards the end of that particular sequence. So a lot of it is just simply her reacting to what's being said on the phone, and she starts out playful and then annoyed, and then suddenly that growing realization of terror to the point where she is crying in the corner. It's still a nasty, shocking sequence even to this day, because it sustains that level of terrorization for the whole 13 minutes that Barrymore is on screen. What I think has been lost to time is the fact that when Scream was originally released, they put a lot of emphasis on Barrymore in the advertising. You look at the original posters, she's very prominently displayed. The original poster that shows someone with a hand over their mouth, that's Barrymore with her hand over her mouth, not Neve Campbell. And this is one of the ways the film homages its horror heritage, in that Barrymore is essentially a false protagonist in the same way that Janet Leigh was in Psycho. She's the big name star that suddenly gets killed and makes you feel like anyone could get offed. And obviously it was very effective because it became formula for the Scream franchise from this point forward to have a big name opening kill. That's one of the many ways that Scream is aware of the tropes and conventions of the horror genre that it's adoring about, but also tries to subvert simultaneously. And the film is undoubtedly a product of the late 90s, the post-Tarantino VHS boom. It's very deliberate that there is a scene that actually takes place in a video rental shop with characters debating plot points. They often name drop movies, and also you have characters that frequently talk about picking up and renting a movie. The characters are very semi-literate in a way that's also simultaneously expected from the audience themselves. They recognize the tropes as we do, and that makes them feel kind of like us, like the horror fans who just happen to be plugged into a movie. This is something that you very much saw in the late 90s. Characters aware that they are in a film. It was very rare before that point to have movie characters talk about the tropes and cliches of other films, but that's exactly what started happening. You look at something like Pulp Fiction or Clerks, Kevin Williamson in his writing has much the same characteristic. That's why it felt relevant at that point in time. It felt like the horror genre was responding almost to the complaints that had become too formulaic by actually pointing out those elements. You've got the big scene where Randy actually lays down the rules of surviving a horror movie. And Scream isn't being subtle about this. It will often point out the convention before subverting it. Take the sequence where Sydney is attacked in her home by Ghostface for the first time. She mentions how a lot of horror victims go up the stairs instead of directly out the front door. Sydney does actually look out the front door in the way that Casey didn't before her, and then she goes back in, and that's when she's attacked. But then she locks the front door behind her, and that forces her to go up the stairs. The movie points out the convention, but then actually gives her a reason to follow it. And then you've got the double door gag, which had been previously established earlier in the movie. That's just clever writing, and Williamson's writing is very much on point through much of the movie. The movie also further reinforces those conventions through a lot of parallel editing and using clips from classic horror movies, especially Halloween, which is often credited as setting the slasher movie in motion. And while Scream is a slasher movie, that particular subgenre has its roots in the old whodunit, and for a lot of the middle section of Scream, it is a classic whodunit. I do think that this portion of the movie is actually the less interesting bit. The film starts out really strong and it has a good finish. it does kind of sag a little bit in the middle. Apparently, the principal being killed, Henry Winkler, who is uncredited in his role, was actually added into the script because there was a very long passage in the middle where no one was actually killed. And you know what? That was probably the right call in retrospect, because it would feel like there wasn't actually all that much going on between the opening and the last act of the movie. It needed something there to give it a little bit of juice. But even though the film is a murder mystery, what genuinely surprised me is how much it actually puts the solution to it in plain sight of the audience. Billy and Stu, the ultimate killers of the movie, actually get identified very early on by Randy, who is meant to be a red herring to the audience because he's so literate. Of course, if you're paying attention to Randy's characterization, he seems genuinely horrified by the murders, so you can quickly rule him out. But the fact that Randy is so perceptive that he actually nails who killed Casey almost immediately is actually kind of brilliant. Skeet Ulrich's Billy is actually under the shadow of suspicion for much of the movie, but then the film tries to psych you out with the twist that he's been seemingly killed by Ghostface directly after having sex with Sidney, which of course would make sense given the rules of the genre. If you have sex, you die. Except you don't, because of course he's one of the killers. The fact there are two killers in the first place is meant to be a surprise, but it makes sense because no one person can actually do all the things that they do in this movie, which is a trap that a lot of horror films actually fall into, where characters seemingly teleport around. The fact that there are two killers actually makes this make sense, so that's kind of brilliant. What I think sets Ghostface apart from other horror villains is that he's not an overtly supernatural presence, or he's not some Hulk that is literally unbeatable. So he's not like Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees. He's literally someone in a costume, and he reacts that way, so characters do fight back against him and do temporarily manage to incapacitate Ghostface on regular occasions. He's a bit of a bumbling doofus, especially if Stu is under the mask, let's be honest. So there is that sense that you can actually get into a fight with Ghostface and win, but also it makes the characters feel like they have more agency in the plot because they are actually striving to survive. They're not doing stupid things for the sake of simply getting killed. I also like the dynamic between the two killers in that Billy is clearly more the brains of the operation and Stu is just a raving maniac, but both of them are psychopathic because they're so film obsessed. They think they're living in one. They're not really living in reality. They think they're following the rules and conventions of a genre, and thus they have no conscience because they don't even feel like they're real, which is really kind of meta when you think about it. I also like the steaminess of Neve Campbell's performance as Sidney. Apparently Campbell is not a big fan of horror movies in reality, which works for the role because Sidney doesn't really believe in these conventions, and also she's not your archetypal horror heroine. For a start, she's not the final girl because Courtney Cox's Gale also survives to the end of the movie, and Cox is really having fun playing this very opportunistic, selfish reporter character. But Sidney does actually defy other genre conventions as well, specifically that she does actually have sex and survive at the end of the movie. Unfortunately, she does lose her virginity to one of the killers, which must be an awful realization to make. I don't think the comedy stuff quite as landed with me as much as the horror stuff did, although I did like some of the in-jokes. Like, I love Wes Craven's cameo as a janitor that is literally wearing the Freddy jumper. That's pretty great. I think Linda Blair pops up very briefly at one point, but I also quite enjoyed David Arquette's performance as Officer Dewey, the very young cop, who kind of provides a bit of comic relief to the action. Apparently he was written as more of like a stereotypical lead, and then Arquette kind of goofed it up, and I think he provides some necessary diffusion. I think a lot of the reason why the film still feels effective and still feels modern is because of the editing. The editing is really tight on the movie. It moves at a fair clip. It's very sharply cut. Several scenes are actually punctuated with a quick white flash frame, which really jolts you as an audience. It feels like Scream just grabs you by the jugular, and that is why the film still still works. Now, on to Scream 2! So I watched Scream 2 last night, which released in 1997, almost a year exactly after the original film hit cinemas. They were quickly trying to make it while still capitalising on the success of the original movie, and you can kind of tell, because it's perfectly alright, but it just doesn't have the spark of the original, at least not in my opinion. At the start of the movie, they're having that conversation about sequels and how sequels suck, which is a very broad generalisation. I'm surprised this room full of horror fans didn't bring up Evil Dead 2. The problem with sequels is that it's very hard to replicate exactly what went right the first time around. Sometimes there's just this kind of alchemy with a movie that hits at just the right moment, and Scream is kind of one of those movies, and I feel like the sequel is trying to do that stuff and do it all over again, but apply the tropes of sequels to it this time. It just doesn't have quite as much of an understanding of that as it does just traditional slasher movies. I don't think what helps Scream 2 is that apparently it was one of the big early online script leaks back in the day, which necessitated huge rewrites during production, and I think that contributes to the movie's overall unfocused feel, where it seems to be shooting in a lot of various different directions simultaneously, and it doesn't feel quite as tightly written as the first movie does. There's lots of characters and there's lots of different subplots. Although, of course, that's also a general problem with sequels. They have to outdo themselves, they have to be bigger, and they have to try and do something different, whilst also being similar enough to the original. And Scream 2 is adhering to that a lot of the time. A lot of what happens in Scream 2 echoes what happens in the earlier movie, but it just doesn't hit the same way. The opening sequence with Jada Pinkett Smith and Omar Epps as an ill-fated couple in a preview screening of Stab, of course based on the events of the original movie, is pretty solid. I like the conversation that the two characters have going into it. I especially think that that's meant to be something of a kind of self-critique of the original movie, which didn't have any major black characters in it, and I do think that there was a little bit of an effort this time around to actually include those characters, so at least that's a positive point for Scream 2. The setup of the Stab movies is kind of weird in universe, because they go into this screening and it's filled with people with ghost face costumes pretending to stab each other. It doesn't seem like anyone's actually watching the movie, they're all just kind of reveling with each other, and you've got the studio handing out replicas of the killer's costume. I mean, that's just weird for a movie that in universe is based on a real life tragedy that was very recent. I feel like the studio wouldn't really be promoting it in that kind of way. I think one of the things that I liked about Scream 2 is actually the scenes we see from Stab over the course of the movie, which of course are recreations of scenes from the original Scream. I believe these were directed by Robert Rodriguez, and they're kind of hilarious in their meta-ness, in that they are scenes that we've seen before, but done in more of a traditional schlocky horror manner, where it's a little bit more explosive. You can really see this in the scene that we see in the opening sequence, where Drew Barrymore's character is replaced by Heather Graham, and there's just a shower scene completely unnecessarily added to the beginning of it, which of course makes sense because it is implied that Gale has kind of just scuzzed up the details to make it even more scandalous. I also love the other scene right before Randy and Dewey go through their suspects, where Luke Wilson of all people is playing the Skeet Ulrich role, and of course you've got the punchline to a gag from the original movie where Tori Spelling is playing Sydney just as she accurately predicted the first time around. Speaking of that scene between Randy and Dewey, that is very much one of the film's highlights. You can easily tell why they chose that as being the film's original teaser trailer, because it sums up what the film is trying to do in terms of just setting up the rules of being a sequel. I do think that David Arquette and Jamie Kennedy do play off of each other quite well. I do think that in general, the most meta elements of Scream 2 are its strongest. Unfortunately, because the movie has to outdo itself, it has to have more characters and more of a body count, and that means I think that that's kind of lost over the course of the movie, a lot of Scream 2 is taking up with fairly extended stalk and kill sequences. I think of the sequence with Sarah Michelle Gellar as Cece that goes on for quite a long time. Gellar was kind of wasted in this movie, and I think that's partly because she was filming Buffy. She does have the notable caveat of being killed in 2 Kevin Williamson movies within the same year. I don't think the direction here from Craven is nearly as strong as it is in the original. It feels bloated and overlong at exactly 2 hours, and at points Craven does seem to be helming it in a kind of workmanlike manner, but then every so often there will be a fairly inspired set piece that reminds you that he does know how to stage scenes effectively. I think probably the tensest moment in Scream 2 is the sequence where Sydney and her friend have to work her way out of the cop car after they get pinned inside of it and they have to go past Ghostface. That is really nerve-jangling stuff, and I wish the sequel kind of hit that more consistently. The soundproofing sequence around the same time is also pretty neat. I just wish that the movie had more of those sparks of invention on a consistent basis. I have to admit I was not really a huge fan of a lot of the new cast members in this sequel. Jerry O'Connell was kind of blah as Sydney's new boyfriend, although he does have that skin-crawlingly embarrassing musical number in the cafeteria. Honestly, I wanted someone to throw a knife in his back in the middle of that sequence. Ow! Now that would have been a good punchline to that. I also appreciate a good David Warner cameo. I don't know why exactly he's in this. You could have easily just deleted him from the movie, but David Warner is David Warner, and he's awesome. I did appreciate they massively expanded Liev Schreiber's role. He was very briefly seen in the original movie. He was someone that Sydney falsely identified as being her mother's killer, and then of course was exonerated by the end of the movie, and now they kind of make that a major thread in the sequel, and seeing Sydney being increasingly uncomfortable in his presence adds a very welcome tension. On one way you can kind of see how he wants to make amends, but for the most part he just wants to use it to catapult himself to fame, and that sequence where he has her cornered on the staircase and he's kind of blocking her in, it's really uncomfortable. Schreiber is very good in the role, especially considering that he was literally blink or you'll miss it in the first one. Once again, you've got this romantic chemistry between Dewey and Gale, which is kind of sweet once you realise the actors were actually dating off screen at the time. Dewey weirdly has the theme from Broken Arrow a lot of the time, which kind of suits his character because it does have that kind of quirky, cool vibe that I think the character has in his head, but in reality he's just kind of weird and awkward, especially given that he has the results of the previous movie where he has some nerve damage and he walks with a limp and his hand appears to be partially paralysed. I do have to admit I have very mixed feelings about the death of Randy halfway through the movie, because yes, it is shocking and unexpected because he's one of the original cast members, and again you get that sense that anyone could die, but unfortunately a lot of the film's overt meta-commentary was attached to that character, so there's a bit of a void once his character is dispatched halfway through, and his absence is very much felt in the second hour. Although points to Randy, he does actually manage to successfully identify one of the killers once again. He probably would have made a great detective if he wasn't dead. One of the major ways this doesn't match up to the original is that the reveal of the killers is very underwhelming. You've got Timothy Oliphant's Mickey, who feels a lot of the time like a pretty carbon copy of Matthew Lillard's Stu from the last movie, in that he's a movie fan that's also psychopathic. He behaves in much the same way. The movie tries to continue this commentary on violence in cinema and whether or not it dictates murders in real life. Of course, the movie doesn't agree with that because Mickey is just going to merely use cinema as an excuse in his trial, but really he's always wanted to be a serial killer. So films or not, he was always destined to try and kill. The problem is that Mickey as a character, you'll notice, disappears halfway through the movie, so it's not really a big leap for the audience to go, Well, it's probably that guy that hasn't appeared in most of the second half of the film. And maybe that's because the bigger intended surprise was Laurie Metcalf as Mrs. Loomis, Billy's mother, who is out for revenge. That just kind of feels a little bit tired. I know the film is trying to reference the original Friday the 13th, where Mrs. Voorhees was the killer. They explicitly reference that earlier in the dialogue, and also it's a payoff to the original Scream. That was the question that Casey failed at the very beginning of Scream. So it's meant to be this very delayed punchline, but it just isn't very effective. The character spends most of the movie pretending to be this local reporter that's bothering Gail, and then she comes out of the woodwork. But I kind of guessed that she was going to be the killer as well, because she just hangs around the movie a lot of the time, and once you start really deducing who could be the possible suspects, you very quickly work out who it could easily be, because most of the other characters could be eliminated simply on the basis of their behaviour, or in the fact of someone like Cotton. It would be kind of obvious to make them the killer, and they're pretty obviously red herrings. And I know I'm being very down on Scream 2, and I'm not trying to say that it's bad or terrible or whatever, it's just that watching it in such close proximity to the original, its faults are very apparent. There's a line in the original Scream where Randy says, "You got to keep it simple, otherwise you'll lose your audience." And Scream 2 kind of falls victim to that. It's trying to be too much at the same time. It just feels like more of a standard conventional slasher movie than the original, which was really something special. Scream 2 is kind of average. It feels more a piece with the movies that Scream inspired in its wake. You think of things like I Know What You Did Last Summer or The Faculty, other Kevin Williamson movies, usually with characters lined up on the poster in a very similar way to Scream. But if I'm this iffy with the first sequel, that doesn't bode well for Scream 3, because a lot of the fans of the series don't like that one.
My groin!
Good thing I went to this with fairly low expectations, because boy is this a step down from even the sequel, and as a closer for an intended trilogy, it's a real disappointment. Do you remember that? When franchises used to actually end instead of continuing ad infinitum? Those were the days. There are a great many problems with Scream 3, but many of them can be directly attributed to the fact they didn't wait to get Kevin Williamson back to write the screenplay. He was very busy at the time that they were trying to produce this movie, so instead they got Ehren Kruger to fill in his place. And unfortunately, Kruger didn't really have any affiliation with the Scream series beforehand, and that meant that he wrote a screenplay that had to be rewritten constantly during production. Again. The very troll production shows in virtually every single decision the film makes. Take the fact that Sydney has a much reduced role in this outing. That's because Neve Campbell was extremely in demand at the time, and she was only available for 20 days of filming, and that meant they had to sideline her character. So in Act 1 she spends most of it secluded by herself, sat at home, and then in Act 2 spends a great chunk of that sat around a police station. Really exciting stuff, but it's compounded by the fact that the story actually revolves around Sydney's mother, and yet Sydney is barely actually herself a part of the story, even though it's directly related to her family. It's a very awkward situation for the film to find itself in. As a result, Dewey and Gale get a lot more prominence and screen time in this outing, although it doesn't feel entirely unnatural because they did have fairly prominent roles in Scream 2. Again, they have this kind of will they, won't they element to their relationship, and honestly, it feels a little bit contrived. The two were married by this point in the franchise, and it would have probably worked better had the characters been on better terms with each other instead of recycling their relationship from the previous movie once again. I'm also aware of the fact they did have to tone down the gore in this outing because of concerns about media violence at the time, which is ironic given the overall point of the Scream franchise, but really, that stuff didn't bother me too much. There's a lot of action going on in the movie regardless. The problem is that the suspense sequences are rather dull and plodding. It feels like Craven's heart isn't quite in this one, and it does feel like the franchise is starting to feel just that little bit stale now. To compensate, the movie is definitely playing more with the meta angle this time around, especially given that the plot of the movie is that they're now in Hollywood and it's set around the making of Stab 3, and all the actors find themselves involved in a real-life serial killer plot. So that angle is fun to a certain extent, but none of the actual actors within the movie are particularly all that interesting. Even though you have actors like Emily Mortimer playing them, none of them are particularly well sketched, aside from Parker Posey's character, who is fantastically funny, shadowing Gale, who she is playing within the movie. So you have this kind of doubling all throughout the movie, and honestly, that was probably one of the funniest parts of it. Parker Posey lifted a lot of fairly dreary exposition scenes simply by just doing her antics with Courtney Cox. The filmmaking angle also allows the film to effectively revisit earlier entries in the series, which does add to that sense of closure as a finale, but it does also remind you that most of the film's best moments are when it's just straight up doing bits from earlier Scream films. I think one of the biggest stabs of invention in Scream 3 is the entire sequence where Sydney visits the film set. First, she encounters Emily Mortimer's character, who is playing Sydney within the movie, in the toilet, which is a reference back to the scene in the original movie where she's attacked by Ghostface in the toilet, which is followed by the set piece where Sydney goes into a replica of her old home and is attacked by Ghostface in exactly the same way as he did in the original, right up to chasing her up the stairs, but also further exemplifies that the series doesn't have all that much new to say by this point. If anything, it kind of seems a little bit self-congratulatory, particularly with the overabundance of cameos in this outing. Jay and Silent Bob turn up for some reason, and Carrie Fisher turns up as a casting director that just happens to look like Carrie Fisher, which again is kind of amusing, but also just maybe stretching the meta-ness just a little bit too far. The writing is noticeably worse than it is in the first two films, and as a result you've got a lot of characters bumbling around like idiots, like they're trying to get themselves killed. A good example of this is in the sequence in the house where the killer starts sending them script pages on the fax machine and the characters keep rushing back into the house to try and read the pages. No! Just keep running, you dozy idiots! And how does no one smell the gas before the house goes up in an enormous explosion? The movie is filled with fairly glaring plot holes. A lot of the first section of the movie is the killer trying to find out where Sydney is in the first place, and then he calls her up at her home with no explanation of how he managed to do that. Does he even know where she lives? The character that is ultimately identified as the killer somehow managing to stage his own death earlier on, and there's no explanation as to how he actually managed to do that, to the point where Gale actually takes a pulse from him and gets nothing. Like, that is very effective death staging, especially for someone that manages to rebound very quickly and start hacking up more people. One of the big gimmicks that really falls flat on its face is the voice changer gimmick. Obviously, all the previous Ghostfaces have used a voice changer, but in this outing, it also allows the killer the ability to impersonate several other characters down the phone, which I suppose in theory might not have been a terrible concept, except for the fact that it's completely ridiculous for a movie set and made in 2000. There was no way this level of technology was available at the time. In a movie made now, this might be a plausible plot point, but definitely not back then. It actually is less terrifying than the regular Ghostface voice, and it just feels really contrived and awkward, like they didn't know how to raise the stakes in this outing. They certainly don't use it to really effective use in the scare sequences, trying to psych out the audience. Like, how has the killer managed to get accurate voice samples of virtually the entire main cast, including Sydney's mother, who's been dead for several years? This is really Mission Impossible style stuff that feels very implausible in the setting of the film. It just goes to show how much Roger L. Jackson was really effective with that voice down the phone. He is way more terrifying than a familiar voice on the other end of the phone. I haven't really talked about him very much over the course of these movies, but a lot of the threat is simply due to the intensity of that voice coming right down the phone. Hello, Sydney. Yeah, that kind of gives you chills, as opposed to Liev Schreiber going, "I'm so-and-so, I'm Cotton." Blah. The trilogy stuff also feels really forced. I did like the scene where Randy turns up posthumously via a videotape, but it also just goes to show that they did really kind of make a mistake by killing off his character in the second movie, something which they kind of acknowledge very briefly in the dialogue, talking about Stab 2. Again, cute, but it's a scene where he's describing all of these things that just point out how utterly contrived the writing is, and pointing out all this like ridiculous backstory that has been retconned and grafted onto the Scream series. There's a lot of emphasis on Sidney's mother. It feels like this is deliberate to try and play up the kind of psycho vibes once again. You've got a shower scene right at the beginning of the movie as well, but it just doesn't feel natural for the characters. And then you've got the real grimness of that particular subplot, in that this is a movie set in Hollywood that turns out to be about industry abuse. And of course, this is a Miramax franchise. This was a series that was produced by the Weinsteins, so this feels really uncomfortable to watch in the year 2023, especially given that the Lance Henriksen character does have a lot of parallels with Harvey Weinstein. And I really don't know how much Craven was aware of Harvey's crimes at the making of this movie, but certainly as someone who had been working through the industry for several decades, I'm sure he was aware of horror stories, and this is meant to be a deliberate critique of the industry, especially given that the Henriksen character says, oh, it was the 70s, it was a different time. The awkward part is, no, it really wasn't. It was just happening off the screen as opposed to inside the realm of the story, unfortunately. But despite the series' ostensible self-awareness, the film throws in not one but several casting couch jokes. There are several characters that talk about sleeping with a director to get a role, which normalizes that kind of behaviour despite ostensibly critiquing it, which only goes to show just how pervasive that kind of attitude was, that it could have that kind of smirking in-joke whilst also having what happens to Sidney's mother in it. The reveal of the killer is also a letdown. It turns out to be Roman, Sidney's half-brother, which might have actually been an interesting development had Sidney been more actively engaged with the story and maybe shared a scene with him at some point, but alas, they don't before the reveal, and so the movie is going for an emotional element which is really not justified by anything that we've seen in the movie. It feels like it comes completely out of nowhere for the most part. They changed who the killer was going to be late in the production. They were going to have two killers, and the other one was going to be Emily Mortimer's character, and as a result there are numerous hints across the movie that she is involved, down to the fact that there's that scene where Sidney catches her in the toilet, or the fact that she suspiciously appears down at the bottom of the hill. They just apparently left those in, even though they go absolutely nowhere and are just dangling threads. And I understand the reasons for why they made this decision, and also the fact that two killers was starting to get a bit formulaic at this point, but if you're going to make a choice like this, maybe do it before you start actually filming the movie and having attack sequences that make absolutely no sense unless there are two killers. The result is the film has loads of plot holes resulting from the fact that Roman seems to be able to teleport and do things in almost impossible amounts of time. Ironically, the very reason why the double killer thing was invented in Scream in the first place, to directly subvert and explain that trope, but instead Scream 3 just presents it entirely at face value. I think it was pretty apparent to everyone that Scream had run its natural course and it was a good time to end the series. But like a slasher villain, just when you think it's dead, it comes back again. So I've actually been watching these films through Sky Cinema because they have virtually every entry in the Scream franchise, except for Scream 4. Luckily, That was a Poundland staple back in the day, so I have a copy of it that I managed to unearth and rip open the shrink wrap on. So, let's talk about Screforum. A decade had passed since Scream 3, and in that time the horror genre had changed quite considerably, enough to open the opportunity for a new Scream movie to come out once again, especially because with 3 you got the sense that there wasn't really all that much new for the movies to actually respond to, almost like the Scream films were starting to respond to their own popularity and the effect that it had on the genre, whereas now Scream could once again be used as a way of criticising the way that horror movies were at that point in time, where they had started to feel formulaic in a different way, in that there was an overabundance of remakes, that the horror genre was kind of eating its own tail, constantly updating and recycling the most classic titles of the genre, including Craven's Own. You think about The Hills Have Eyes or The Last House on the Left. Scream 4, while not a remake, it is definitely a sequel, is directly commenting on that trend. Obviously this is triggered by the film's plot, where Sidney revisits Woodsboro on a book tour, which just happens to coincide with the anniversary of the murders, and someone is rebooting the killings all over again. And so in that way, it allows Craven to do a lot of the mirroring that he's so fond of. It allows him to effectively revisit the original movie once again, in much the same way he did in Scream 3, but far more effectively here, in that he deliberately evokes elements of the first movie to try and flip them on their head, instead of just simply reorchestrating them all over again. If horror audiences were savvy in 1996, then they were even more so and even more jaded in 2011, and you kind of see this in the scene where they're talking about remakes and how they have to keep trying to top the original, to the point where the subversions have become the new normal, almost like what Scream helped pioneer in the first place has become accepted. Craven and Kevin Williamson have realised this, because what has happened now is that they try to push those subversions to the point where it actually becomes absurd. You see this in the opening sequence, which isn't just one opening kill, it's several sets of opening kills, like a Russian doll. Kevin Williamson is writing the screenplay again, and you can see a huge improvement from its immediate predecessor. It feels a lot more like a Scream movie this time out, and feels a lot more tonally consistent. It also has much better written twists than the third movie attempted to do. It genuinely feels like it should have been the actual third movie, and they should have gave it a little bit more time between sequels to really give Williamson the chance to do it properly. Instead, it feels like his attempt to try and course correct where the series had ended up. All the Scream movies have been about trauma, particularly in regard to Sidney, who was dealing with the murder of her mother in the first movie, and then with each passing sequel, the legacy of the Ghostface attacks personally coming after her. And you see it again in this movie, where she's trying to reclaim that victim narrative by empowering herself to write a book about her experiences. But Scream 4 posits that trauma is cyclical, that each generation processes it in different ways and is also doomed to repeat it. You've got that line from Dewey about how one generation's tragedy is the next one's joke. Even on the anniversary of the killings, they're still holding a massive stab movie marathon, the series that was literally inspired by the killings in universe, which might seem in quite grotesque bad taste. I'm surprised that Dewey didn't just outright shut that down. He doesn't even seem aware of it in the movie, which seems odd. But even so, there is this idea that there is a weird irony because of their detachment from the events. What the film seems to be commenting on with its new young cast, even more than remakes themselves, is the rise of social media and vlogging in its relative infancy back in 2011. I feel like when Scream 4 was first released, it was fairly lukewarmly received. A lot of people felt it was a rather belated attempt to resurrect the franchise, but looking at it now, it does feel like its commentary and satire is unusually prescient, especially this idea of commoditizing trauma, of using that to leverage a fan base. The killers in this movie film their murders not only because they want to make a movie out of it, but also because they are constantly attuned to technology and constantly trying to one-up what the previous killers have done by effectively making the idea of following genre conventions in a horror film literal. You have the character of Robbie who wears a webcam on his head, which is a very early satire of a generation that needs to record and post their every experiences, which has only become more prevalent since the film came out. But also within universe, the Woodsboro tragedy has become commoditized. The Stab franchise continues on and on into its 6th and 7th installment, ironically, just like Scream itself has, well beyond its original origin point, even to the extent where the Ghostface voice is just an app that you can get on your phone. This is taken to its darkest extreme with the reveal of Sidney's cousin Jill being the architect behind the murders. Having always envied Sidney, she wants the notoriety and the adulation of being a survivor, but doesn't really realise the trauma of having to live through all of those events. She has a detachment from it because she is a generation away from the events. That allows her to commit these cold, calculating crimes. And Emma Roberts is fantastic, especially in the reveal near the end of the movie. It feels like it plays upon Roberts' very squeaky clean persona and then deliberately turns her into the absolute worst version of herself, and Roberts is relishing that opportunity. She is wickedly evil at the end of the film. And the film holds up a dark mirror to the original movie, almost like a kind of warped perspective on it, particularly in the finale, where the equivalents of Sidney and Randy, the original film's survivors, become this film's killers in Jill and Charlie. Although, let's be honest, Charlie was probably always going to become a killer, because if you're a film fan, there's a high probability you're probably going to be one of the murderers in a Scream movie. But nevertheless, you have this kind of warped idea of trying to resurrect and recreate the past in a kind of perverse way to try and leverage that for adulation. But it's not enough to relive the past, you have to outdo it. Hence the hospital finale, which is really over the top and really silly, but in a fun way. The movie primed you that it was going to head in that direction with the opening sequence, because much like that, it pushes to the point of absolute absurdity. The movie is deliberately turning the events into kind of like this dark joke in just how ridiculously extreme they can get, because they've done 4 movies out of this. How much can the same things happen to the same characters? That becomes the joke in of itself. And yeah, it is actually really fun in its success. Scream 4 turned out to be Wes Craven's final film, and I think that it's a fitting farewell for the director. Having him revisit the movie that rejuvenated the final part of his career, Craven seems to be enjoying getting back to the franchise after a long break and getting back to its roots from 1996, being darker and meaner. Ghostface in this movie is especially ruthless. There's a lot less of him bumbling around and falling over chairs, and there's some pretty brutal gore in this, certainly the strongest since the first movie. I would genuinely place this above the second and third movies. It feels a lot more coherent and complete than those in terms of its commentary and satire, and more in keeping with the spirit of the original film, whilst obviously not matching that because it is an inherently derivative work. But it's just nice for the franchise to finally find its edge once again, something that had been missing because it had been too content to rest on its meta laurels. This movie's got an absolutely stacked cast. A lot of them are just doing cameos, like Anna Paquin and Kirsten Bell, who pop up very briefly at the beginning of the film. You got Alison Brie as Sidney's awful publicist who gets fired and then dispatched very soon after. But I wanted to add a few extra words about Hayden Panettiere as Kirby, who is far and away the most successful new character introduced in this movie. I think Panetiere's performance is what sells it. As written, it could have potentially come off as a little bit too try-hard, but actually she's really likeable in the part. She has that kind of self-awareness that fits the franchise perfectly. It's very easy to see why she became such a fan favourite, and they've been asking to have her back in the sequels, even though really, in this movie, she was quite conclusively killed off. She got stabbed in the gut twice. I mean, that is potentially survivable, but the movie certainly doesn't imply that she survived that, although, of course, she does get better, and she comes back in Scream 6. So that means we're now onto the new movies. Scream 4, alas, didn't launch a new trilogy like it was intended to at the time, and the franchise lay dormant for another decade, with the exception of the MTV series, which I'm definitely not going to cram in. The thing that I worry about going into the 5th movie is the fact that we've lost Wes Craven now. He passed away back in 2015, and he was such a major part of these movies, and I know that Williamson is involved with the new films, but obviously with new directors it's going to take a very different tone in the future. So I wonder how those new directors will lead Scream into a different era of cinema. Okay, I have to admit, it has been a few days since I watched Scream 2022, but I've been editing this video and a whole bunch of other stuff, so my schedule's completely out of whack. But anyway, let's get down to Scream 5, as most people would actually call it, except the film is actually called Scream, like the first movie, just to be extra confusing. And yes, I am aware the film makes a joke about that. It's still annoying and pointless. They couldn't have just changed the S to a 5. So I actually saw this as part of the Scream double feature on March 8th. The 2022 film followed directly after by the 6th movie, and you know what? It was actually quite a fun experience, not least of which because the cinema staff got in on the act. One of them was dressed up as Ghostface, standing directly behind the doors into the auditorium to scare the crap out of people. Although actually not me, because I saw them through the window of the auditorium and thought, that's a statue. So I actually went out and tried to take a photo of it on my phone, and then they started moving, and then I just got all awkward, and I went, yeah, good one. Yeah, thumbs up, Matthew, you embarrassment. Nevertheless, it was quite funny to hear from my seat people going, oh, fucking hell, because clearly they didn't see it before walking in. And then there was another cinema employee sat a little bit behind me who was a plant for Ghostface to chase around the auditorium while the ads were playing, which was quite funny, not least of which because Ghostface did actually trip up. I don't know if that was actually an accident or that was completely intentional, because Ghostface does trip up a lot in these movies. Either way, 10 out of 10, top marks. So, getting to the movie itself, this installment is now helmed by the Radio Silence team, Matt Bettinelli-Olpin and Tyler Gillett, who previously worked on Ready or Not, which I really quite liked. And it takes aim at legacy sequels. You think of things like the new sequel Star Wars trilogy, or the latest iteration of the Halloween movies, which is clearly what this is most directly inspired by, right down to the fact that it has a name that is identical to the original movie, it brings back the original cast, but it also ups the gore quite considerably. The recent Halloween movies are really, really gory, and Scream, the 2022 iteration, is extremely violent, well beyond anything the series has done in the past. Although the film does actually call them requels because they're rebooting the franchise, but they're also sequels to the original in that they have the original set of characters, but also follow a bunch of new protagonists, which is precisely what Scream 5 does. Although, let's be honest, no one actually calls them that, we just call them legacy sequels. But still, it's a topic that is worthy of being satirised and skewered in the traditional Scream way, and of course we have a scene where characters point out all the tropes of these movies. The film effectively serves as a celebration of the Scream series in that in addition to the core cast returning, you've also got a very prominent dedication to Wes Craven at the end, but also numerous previous cast members from other Scream movies pop up in cameos all throughout. So there's lots of fun Easter eggs for the fans, but also most of the new cast are now directly descended from previous characters, especially from the original. And that's something that I feel a little bit mixed about. I did quite like Mindy, who is descended from Randy, and effectively serves as his replacement in the movie. She's the movie fan that explains all the rules of an ongoing series. On the other hand, you have Sam, played by Melissa Barrera, who is the new protagonist of this series, who, as it turns out, is directly descended from original killer Billy Loomis, which is a really forced retcon. They've added all this backstory that he was having some kind of affair and he knocked someone up, and now we have Sam. But it just doesn't feel very organic. But there is an interesting idea at the center of this, that there is something passed down from her father, some kind of killer instinct, and she's wrestling with those mental health issues. Skeet Ulrich makes an unlikely return to the series, playing Billy once again. He is talking to her in her head, and so she is trying to not surrender to those instincts. The movie doesn't really properly convince you about that, and also I just don't think that Barrera's performance is particularly strong in the movie. This required someone to really do a lot of heavy lifting, and unfortunately I don't think Barrera is up to the task. Unfortunately, she's shined off the screen by Jenna Ortega as a half-sister Tara, despite the fact that Ortega, after the opening sequence, pretty much spends the entire rest of the movie in a hospital bed or in a wheelchair. That's because Ortega has so much screen presence. Even at her young age, she feels like a consummate professional, and Barrera, despite being a decade older, looks much less experienced, and as a result, you do find yourself thinking, why didn't they make her the protagonist of the movie? Aside from the fact that if they gave her the Billy Loomis plotline, Ortega is a decade too young for that to truly convince. Unfortunately, Ortega does get a little bit sidelined after the opening. She effectively fills the Drew Barrymore role at the beginning of the original Scream, and I do like the nods they have all throughout that sequence. There's a moment where she pulls a knife out of the rack in exactly the same way that Barrymore did, but she is really great in the opening sequence and really makes that character into someone you want the rest of the film to follow, and unfortunately it's just not really about her. And Scream 5 does the typical legacy sequel thing in that it's effectively a remake of the first film but with a brand new cast, and sometimes subverts your expectations of what you remember from the original. But I've got to be honest, I've never been a huge fan of legacy sequels doing that, because they're always promised as being something new, and then they just go back to what they've done before. You think about Ghostbusters Afterlife. I really like the opening act of that movie, and then it just turns into Ghostbusters. And Scream 5 isn't quite on that level, but it's pretty close to the original Scream, and I understand why these legacy sequels are doing that. It's the same reason why they share the titles with their original films, in that effectively they are a new version for a new generation and introducing them to the series through references from the past. The problem is that Scream 4 literally did this a decade ago, and I watched that movie hours before I watched Scream 5. Now I know that that is not the context that most people would be viewing it under, but the thing is, you do watch the 2022 Scream and go, well, Wes Craven kind of did this himself beforehand, right down to the fact that the finale of the movie is meant to be a reversal of the original film and kind of a funhouse mirror version of it. Scream 4 did it first, and it kind of did it better. And I'm not saying that I hated it, I liked it well enough, but I do think there comes a point where these movies start using the originals as crutches. I especially think that's the case with Scream 2022 in its final act, especially the moment where Mindy is on the sofa, exactly like Randy was, saying, look behind you, effectively a remake of that scene. And I know that does go into an attack because she spots Ghostface behind her, and that is new, but nevertheless, they go out of their way to replicate things that we've seen before, and Scream by this point has already gone back to the original in virtually every single sequel that it's done, but especially in the fourth and the fifth movies. And going back to all the new characters being related to the old ones, it's too reliant on the audience's nostalgia. You can't say to the audience, oh, like this character, they're exactly the same as the old one, because you've got to make them distinctive in their own right, away from their ties to the original. You can't just connect to the past and simply leave it at that. And Scream 2022 is unfortunately a little bit guilty of that. It does point that out about legacy sequels, but it doesn't satirize it effectively, nor does it avert it. Going back to the original cast, I think they're well integrated into the movie. They have prominent spots in it, but they aren't stealing focus away from the new cast. It is effectively a passing of the torch, which is exactly what it needs to be. Sydney, for example, doesn't properly appear until about the halfway point and doesn't really get involved with the film until near the third act. Gale doesn't pop up until halfway through, and the earliest to turn up is Dewey, played by David Arquette. And of course, he finally pops his clogs in this movie. And I know that's divided the fan base, but at some point they do have to try and kill one of these characters off to have some kind of jeopardy in the movie. The previous sequels have kept talking about how no one was safe, but in reality, you never believed that the core group of characters was going to die, whereas in this case, they did actually commit to it. I just wish that it was actually shocking and wasn't so clearly telegraphed in the hospital set piece. When Dewey goes back and the doors slam and it has that kind of reverberant echo, you know he's not coming back. There is a finality about it, but it feels really contrived. It feels like the film just kind of goes out of its way to kill that character rather than it just kind of happening out of nowhere. That would have been shocking, whereas when it actually occurs you go, yeah, that's exactly how I thought that was going to pan out to be. But I think Dewey's death also feels kind of disappointing because there's never a moment where the core cast are all together at once, ironically doing exactly what the Star Wars sequels did before it. And I know that there's a very brief scene between Dewey and Gale, which is given added charge by the off-screen divorce of Arquette and Cox. You can see a little bit of that bleed into the scene, but nevertheless, it would have been nice to have them all in the same space just at one point before one of them actually got the axe. The most amusing thing about Scream 5 is that it's directly a commentary on toxic fan bases. Radio Silence got their start on YouTube making shorts, and now they've done good. They're big budget horror directors. So when they take these stabs at the YouTube community, it's very accurate, to say the least. I especially love the scene where one of the characters is watching a video review of Stab A, allegedly directed by Rian Johnson, which is of course a reference to the fact the 8th Star Wars movie is The Last Jedi, which had a very polarizing reception, to say the least. That's a pretty funny joke, especially because you watch that video and it feels like kind of the cringy ones that you'd probably find elsewhere on the platform. No disrespect to my fellow creators, but it does skewer that sense of entitlement, that sense that it's changed, so now it's bad, when actually I would not describe myself as being one of those people. I would describe myself as being, they didn't take enough chances, they didn't do enough different in this outing, as I've said previously. But nevertheless, this idea of not making sure anything changes comes into the killer's MO, because as it turns out, they are fans of the original, so they are determined to try and recreate it. Slightly embarrassingly, I do have to admit that I was actually caught off guard by one of the killer reveals. I genuinely didn't anticipate Jack Quaid's character to be one of the killers, because honestly, he was so bumbling, and of course I should have known better because he was the love interest. It was inevitable he was going to turn out to be one of the villains, but I completely fell for the axe, not least of which because I spent most of the film going, he really reminds me of Rainn Wilson, but he's clearly not. I think my detective skills might have rotted by this point, but nevertheless, he really is quite fun in the role. He is clearly having an absolute whale of a time, especially in his final scenes, getting to absolutely ham it up. And I did have fun with Scream 5, especially watching it with an audience of fans of the series, because there are such gnarly gags in it, especially that fire gag near the end of the movie. It's just that it's too indebted to what came before. At some point, Scream does have to leave the original movie behind for the most part. So that's it. I've now watched all the Scream movies all the way to the 6th one, when last week I started out having watched 0 Scream movies. I'm going to be reviewing the 6th one as a separate video, so be sure to watch out for that. But you're probably wondering, how would I rank the series having run through them all now? Well, I'll answer that. Obviously, the first one at the top. I would actually put the fourth film in second. As a sneaky preview, I'd actually put the sixth film in third. 5 is right behind that. I'd actually say the two are fairly interchangeable, and I wasn't really a huge fan of the original sequels, so number 2 is in 5th place, and of course in dead last is the third movie. And I'm sure you all have your own opinions, which you will let me know in the comments, while also telling me just how much my opinion is wrong. But now, a word from our sponsor.
Hello, Sydney. What's your favorite scary movie?
Because you can now get it from Movie Palette. Imagine your favourite films as a piece of art. In this case, this is Terminator 2 Judgment Day. But of course, you can pick any of your favourite scary movies to put on your wall, including the entire Scream franchise. So go to moviepalette.com and use the code FilmBrain15 to get 15% off your order. Now, my favourite scary movie is Cats. If you like the ridiculous amount of work I put myself under for this, you can give me a tip on my Ko-fi page, or with YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can buy some of my merch from my TeePublic page. Or you can take a stab at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, or you can simply like, share and subscribe. Those all help as well. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.